You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Lululemon just made the coziest matching set to get you to and from Pilates. Meet the Steady State hoodie and sweatpants, a fan favorite from our men's line, reimagined in super loft fabric that's smooth on the outside, fleecy soft on the inside. Level up your comfort in the new Steady State Super Loft, available now at lululemon.com.
When you want your spring break to feel like... and your kids' pool day to feel like... and your hotel bed to feel like... ooh, and room service to feel like... because at Hilton, hospitality feels like...
Your cabana's ready. Would you like fresh towels?
it matters where you stay. Book now at Hilton.com. Hilton, for the stay.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more.
No more Mr. Nice Siege Daddy.
I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy, and this is Ancient History Fangirl. And we are back today with another wonder of the ancient world to tell you all about. This is another weird one. I don't know why I chose to take all the statues of men, but I did.
You really made a choice. That is a decision that you made.
It really is. At the time when we were divvying it up, it wasn't like a conscious one, but I do remember telling Jenny, I'm like, I do want to do the statue that we're going to talk about today, a giant statue. It is just as iconic as Zeus at Olympia. It's just as mysterious, and I would argue just as fascinating. Jenny, I'm talking about the Colossus of Rhodes.
I cannot wait to get all up in the nooks and crannies of this statue.
You might be disappointed. We don't know an awful lot about the nooks and crannies.
And yet somehow you have like 16 pages of information about the Colossus of Rhodes. So let's get started.
I was super excited to cover this because I have been fascinated with the really iconic artwork of it that has been circulating since medieval times. Many of you close your eyes right now. When I say Colossus of Rhodes, what do you picture?
I picture straddling.
Yes, you're picturing a huge, sometimes naked or maybe only wearing a loincloth man who's straddling the harbor of Rhodes. He has one foot on either side of that harbor, forcing boats to pass underneath his spread legs. It is the ultimate man spreading that dates back to ancient times. It's also the ultimate upskirting.
Yes, everyone who enters the harbor of Rhodes must upskirt this statue. Must.
Or avert your gaze. You could be smote if you look upskirt.
Right. Could you be smoten if you looked upskirt?
Well, you could argue that because it is a statue of the god Helios, who is always watching you masturbate, that you could be smoten by the sun with sun poisoning or sunburns or anything else. But
you're not supposed to look directly at the sun.
You potentially should not be looking directly at Helios' dong. Because, Jenny, this is the episode of the season that we've been waiting for to make fun of a dude's giant dong.
We need absolutely no excuse to do that, though. Like, we will put dick jokes in where there are no... You'd think there would be no dick jokes in this episode, but there are. Oh, there are.
So, to make this story more ridiculous, as I mentioned earlier, the statue isn't just any naked man. It's of Helios, who is, as fans of the podcast know, everyone's favorite sun god, who just so happens to be everywhere all at once, generally watching people have sex and masturbate. He's weird.
So the reason we think that Helios is always watching you masturbate is that in the mythology, correct me if I'm wrong, he's always like, I don't know, telling people's secrets and stuff, like spying on people because he's the sun, he's up in the sky, he can see everything. Is that correct?
Exactly. He's always telling everyone all the tea. If the sun is out, he is there, he is watching you, and he is not discreet, and I love him for it.
And so, you know, if you happen to glance up skirt at this spread-legged, spredaggled statue, don't feel too bad because rest assured that Helios has absolutely looked up there into your bits. He's seen it all, okay? Don't feel bad.
Yes. Helios is, as we've mentioned, a deity who has all the gossip and absolutely no boundaries. So you're probably asking what would have possessed the people of Rhodes to build a giant statue of Helios in their harbor? Why that god? Why that place? What does it all mean?
Join us as we unravel the mysteries that surround this statue, the cult of Helios, the island of Rhodes, and meet a few of my personal favorite historical figures. Oh, this is so great. Antigonus the One-Eyed and Demetrius the Besieger, two people from the War of the Diadochi with very flamboyant names who I cannot wait to write my own episodes about and potentially novels about someday.
Yeah, and Ptolemy the First, whose name is not quite as interesting, but he Ptolemaied.
He needed no descriptor to his name. He's just Ptolemy the First, and he's gonna Ptolemy all over the landscape, whether you asked for it or not. Rhodes is a stunningly beautiful island. It is the largest of the Dodecanese Islands, which is a group of 15 large islands and 150 small islands off the coast of Anatolia that mark the easternmost edge of the Sea of Crete. So these are islands in the Hellenic world, right?
They're islands in the Hellenic world. Some are, I think most of them are part of Greece today, but I'm not 100% sure of that. But yes, they were islands in the Hellenic world. They would sometimes change hands depending on who is in charge. We're going to talk about that a little bit in this episode when we talk about Jenny's boy, Demetrius the Besieger.
Cool. Okay. So overall, Rhodes is the fourth largest of all the Greek islands. In ancient times, it was a major hub with access to 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. In short, Rhodes was a hugely important place, and the harbor of Rhodes was a vital stop on trade routes across the ancient Mediterranean.
And I wanted to start here with how important Rhodes was as a trading outpost before I get too into the history of the Colossus of Rhodes, because they are actually directly related. And it is this slightly complicated relationship that gives us a lot of insight into the statue and its role in the ancient world. First, let's start with Helios, with the sun, which might sound like a strange place to begin, but I promise you it's not. The sun played a huge role in ancient Greek culture. It was both life-giving and brutal. And Rhodes, in general, is an island renowned for its sun. Even today, it is known for being a place that sun worshippers and tourists seek out for a holiday destination.
This is what Bettany Hughes tells us about the importance of the sun and the worship of Helios in her book 7 Wonders of the Ancient World. Quote, "Spend any time in the eastern Mediterranean and it is impossible not to appreciate that closeness to the sun. The fireball that renders whole seas red, which can pierce through fine marbles and turn a hillside into a cornucopia of color. This was, too, we must not forget, a world where there was little clock time, only lives beaten out to the rhythm of the dawn and noon and eventide. Rhodes happens to sit in a band of territory that enjoys over 3,000 hours of sunshine per year. And what could be more central to life than sun worship? We know now that our greatest star did indeed create life on Earth. We are truly children of the sun, and Rhodes was the center of mighty Helios' cult."
Yeah, and it's so important, and that's intrinsically why Rhodes is so tied to Helios. It's really not surprising that the island found itself as the cult home of the titan Helios. And I also wanted to stop for a minute because in her book, Bettany Hughes goes on to point out the importance of the sun and its behavior in the ancient world. And it's a thing we've covered in so many other episodes, but when the sun acted strangely, i.e. was dimmed or appeared to go backwards in the sky or offered no warmth, we find evidence for this in mythology. And while we understand what this means in modern times, it could be solar flares, it could be volcanoes, other natural disasters and natural phenomena, ancient cultures didn't. Instead, they created this mercurial sun god who was prone to anger and must be appeased at all costs. And again, just think back to our Yule episode and all the rituals that were performed to ensure the sun came back again in the spring. The disappearance of the sun was a real fear.
Yeah, I mean, think about the episodes that we did on Teotihuacan, 536 AD, the ancient volcanic murder mystery. This is well documented in the ancient sources that the sun occasionally got weird, and people incorporated that into their mythology and attributed that behavior to gods, and sometimes built whole religions on appeasing the sun so it would come back again, and required sometimes sacrifices around that would last for hundreds or maybe thousands of years, that like the trauma of that could last for centuries.
And I just want to be very clear, I'm not talking about human sacrifices here in the cult of Helios. I've not done a deep dive, but I have not seen anything in the research that I have done that would make me think that. So we'll talk a little bit more about Helios and his worship in a few minutes. But yeah, it is so fascinating. The sun was so important, and people just couldn't understand when it acted weirdly and how to make it stop acting weirdly. They didn't know that this could take years before it would be sorted if it was some kind of volcanic winter or who knows.
And taking a slight departure, we wanted to move from the sun worship to talk about the early settlers of this island. This is a quote from an article on Greeka.com about the history of Rhodes and the first settlers there. Quote, "The first settlers are believed to have come from the coasts of Asia Minor during the late Neolithic age. Over time, the island emerged as an important commercial center that had established trade relations with Minoan Crete, Cyprus, Egypt, Phoenicia, and mainland Greece. During the 15th century BC, it was settled by the Mycenaeans, and 4 centuries later by the Dorians. This resulted in the island's division into 3 influential city-states: Ialissos, Lindos, and Kamairos. I may have mispronounced any or all of those. Apologies. During the classical era, Rhodes was already a strong naval power and was actively involved in the political conflicts of the time. Many temples and structures, such as the Acropolis of Rhodes, were also built in this time period. After the Battle of Salamis and the defeat of the Persians, the island became a part of the Delian League, an organization led by Athens. This led to Rhodes's participation in the Peloponnesian War, toward the end of which, in 408 BC, the 3 city-states of Ialissos, Lindos, and Kamairos combined and formed the city of Rhodes.
Just think about how big that is. That is just the city of Rhodes. But we're going to get there. And Lindos, incidentally, we'll find out, is very famous because the architect of the Colossus of Rhodes came from Lindos. Now, I wanted to include this quote because I'm pretty sure it came from a Greek to English website, and I really enjoy finding both academic sources and also sources that are in different countries' own words about how they look at their history, but also because it gives us some insight into the early history of Rhodes. How this island became a hub for trade across the ancient Mediterranean, adopting relationships and exchange with the Minoans, Cyprus, Egypt, Phoenicia, and mainland Greece. This really highlights how central Rhodes was to so much of the ancient Mediterranean. And as time went on, Rhodes became more powerful, mostly due to its navy and its pirates, and would play a big part in many conflicts. Even though the island was removed from mainland Greece, it would have a role in much of the political and military endeavors of the other Hellenic states. And of course, this quote explains why Rhodes became the mammoth, sprawling city that eventually demanded its Colossus.
So let's break down the city of Rhodes and the island's history a little bit more. First, what made Rhodes, the city, so very important? Here is a quote from Britannica.com. Quote, "The city of Rhodes, with its 5 harbors, was ideally placed on the island of the same name to prosper from trade during the Hellenistic domination of the Mediterranean under Alexander the Great's successors, especially when more and more cities were established in the east. The island's wealth and strategic position on trade routes did not go unnoticed by ambitious foreign rulers." I mean, the city of Rhodes is big. We've established that. It would have had to be pretty big to have 5 harbors. But it was also strategically located kind of in the middle of everything. And it was a way station between the Mediterranean world and the east, as well as on the way further south to Crete and eventually Africa. Rhodes believed it was the center of the universe, and for a time it was the center of the Mediterranean universe.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to remember again that the way travel worked at this time period, Jenny, correct me if I'm wrong, was island hopping, right? You go from one to one to one.
Yeah, that was how sea travel worked. And sea travel was often, it would have been faster for trade and other purposes than land travel a lot of the time, sometimes safer. I mean, you would have had to deal with storms and pirates, but if you're going over land, there's other dangers. It's a lot more physically demanding and things like that. So when you wanted to get somewhere fast, you would travel by sea. And in the ancient Mediterranean world, the seagoing vessels were not long-distance seagoing vessels. Like, they did a lot of island hopping.
One of the other things is some things were only made on certain islands or in certain places. So you had to ship them around somehow. So where did the ancient people of Rhodes get these grand ideas for that they needed a huge Colossus? Jenny, here's when we get to dig a little bit into the mythology of the island, and you know how much I love getting that mythology on. There are 2 myths that surround the island of Rhodes. They both sort of involve a nymph named Rhodes and, of course, the Titan Helios. So, the first myth goes like this. At the end of the War of the Olympians with the Titans, this was called the Titanomachy, Helios kind of goes MIA for a while at the worst possible time. We're not sure where he pieced off to while Zeus was doing the very important work of dividing the spoils of war. But it was very clear that he was not in the same room as everyone else. And when Helios rocked up, he's one of the few titans who didn't get imprisoned at the end of this war, all of the good spoils had been given away. And Zeus was like, well, we really can't afford to piss off Helios, so I have to give this guy something. And that something was the island of Rhodes. Apparently, the island of Rhodes was still covered by water. And it's this that makes me think so much about what the ancient Greeks knew about the creation of islands and the earth in general. That is a digression we don't have time for, but can you just imagine? They're like, I can see the island under the sea rising up.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of those islands were volcanic, right?
Yeah, but also there were so many earthquakes. Things were shifting all the time.
And you can see that in the stories of the various wonders of the ancient world we cover. A lot of them, if they stand long enough, are destroyed by earthquakes. So anyway, this is what Pindar in his Olympian Ode 7 tells us. Quote, "And there grew up from the watery wave this island, Rhodes, and great Helios, who begets the fierce rays of the sun, holds her in his dominion, that ruler of the horses breathing fire. There long ago he, Helios, lay with Rhodes and begot 7 sons, endowed beyond all men of old with genius of thoughtful mind. And of these one begot the eldest Ialissos and Chimeros and Lindos." Oh, Ialissos, Chimeros, and Lindos. "And in 3 parts they divided their father's land, and of 3 citadels the brothers held each his separate share, and by their 3 names are the cities called." So I feel like there's some working backwards here from what the cities are to explain via myth, right? So in this myth, the island of Rhodes and also the nymph who protected it was named Rhodes. Is he banging an island? Is he banging a nymph? Well, kind of hard to say which came first, the island or the nymph, or are they inextricably linked? Is it an island that turns into a nymph? Is she the personification of this island? I don't know. I'm just assuming that she was in human form when they banged. That's what I'm assuming. That's the assumption, but we cannot guarantee that.
Helios had some wild taste. That's all I'm going to say about that.
He had some interesting proclivities, shall we say. Greek mythology has a weird tradition of having islands being birthed from the sea as gods, or gods turning into islands, like the tale of Asteria, the goddess of falling stars, turning into the island of Delos. For example, it's fascinating and maybe a topic for a future Patreon, but let's get back from the edge of this rabbit hole and continue on with our story. Can we please stay on track? I just want to know what the Colossus was straddling, and could I see his dong? That's why I'm here.
So the other myth, Jenny, goes like this. Helios still missed out on that great big dividing of the spoils of war, but he saw the island of Rhodes, already fully risen from the sea, and was like, I want that island, please and thank you. Because on that island was a beautiful nymph named Rhodes, who is sometimes a nymph and sometimes the island itself. She is sometimes the daughter of Poseidon, sometimes she's Helios' own daughter, which is ew. We're not going there. And Helios just really wanted to get with her. He made her one of his wives, and he had 7 kids with her. Because Titans, Jenny, they're just like us.
Right, they are.
So relatable.
Where are my multiple wives and my 7 kids?
My wife who may or may not be a cousin or island or daughter. I don't know.
My daughter island wife. Just like us. So anyway, all of this is to say that the island of Rhodes was very sacred to Helios. Okay, that's what we're trying to tell you. And on this island, there was a cult dedicated to the worship of Helios. As Bettany Hughes tells us in 7 Wonders of the Ancient World, quote, "Here on Rhodes, from at least the time when the classical temple of Artemis at Ephesus and Artemisia's tomb were being raised, Helios was a central cult, honored in the Pact Helia festival, which took place every 5 years. The Helian Games involved running races and performances, a number of which were hosted in the stadium and the theater of Rhodes' Acropolis, all now in sun-bleached fields, found and excavated in the 20th century, but then damaged by artillery fire during World War II. This festival was an extreme and excessive affair. Men and women, it seems, came from far and wide to participate. There was a famous competition of the kithara, the lute-like instrument which we encountered in Ephesus. A 4-horse chariot was sacrificed to the sea, hopefully not with actual horses attached, but you never know, ancient world. And premier offerings were given to Helios, the giant Colossus sculpture being one such dedicated to the great god of fire.
And very importantly, Helios had a 4-horse chariot of immortal horses who carried the sun across the sky. He's very famously known for the myth of Phaeton, his son who wanted to drive the chariot. But anyway, that's why the 4-horse drawn chariot is so important. It's a real callback to that and to the keeping the sun regular, keeping the sun in the sky and going in the right direction and bringing them everything they needed. So I really wanted to include this quote because it gives us a good look at how important Helios was as a god in the Hellenistic world and to the people of Rhodes. People came from far and wide for this. This titan, this literal personification of the sun, was vital to the inhabitants of the island. And much like the statue of Zeus at Olympia, the worship of Helios was a crucial part of life in Rhodes. People came from far and wide to worship him, and they brought offerings of incredible value and wealth, including sacrificing a huge 4-horse chariot into the sea, because it was believed that the sun rose and set in the sea. And we're going to discuss this more in detail later when we talk about the actual Colossus of Rhodes. But Jenny, I have to tell you, there wasn't just one Colossus of Helios. There were several. Much like the Zanes, the statues of Zeus that littered Olympia. There were so many of them. There were like hundreds of them. Some of these statues contained the names of winners and others the names of cheaters. These colossi, were found all over Rhodes. They weren't all of Helios, but they were all called Colossus, and they must have been very big. What purpose did they serve? Why did they need potentially more than one Helios Colossus? Well, some things are truly ancient mysteries.
I have questions. How many colossi were there? And how big were they? Were there any that were bigger than the famous Colossus?
I don't think any were bigger than the famous Colossus. I feel like I'd give you the exact number later. It might have been 100. It might have been 1,000. But part of why I think they might have existed, and again, I haven't found a definitive answer, was when we talk about the creation of the Colossus, which we'll get to in a little bit, there was a lot of stuff that Rhodes was famous for. One of them was their craftsmen. And some of how they would make these big statues was they would test it out sort of at life size. So it's possible some of these big colossi, some of these statues might have been attempts at making the Colossus, or just how big they could get things cast and the dimensions and stuff like that. I could be wrong. Again, I haven't found any definitive reason for them. I think there was about 100. I don't know that they were all of Helios, but I kind of feel like if they're called Colossus, they might have been. Anyway, so there wasn't always a Colossus standing at the harbor of Rhodes, guarding over the city. The Colossus definitely did not stand the way many of us are picturing it standing.
Why do we picture it straddling the harbor of Rhodes? Where does that come from?
It's actually very famously from a medieval image. I talk about it a little bit later on in the episode, but that's where it comes from. And it also is part of the mystery of how we are trying to figure out where the Colossus stood. There's a lot of debates about where it might have been, but we'll get to it when we actually make the Colossus. Okay, but as you can tell, Helios was always first and foremost on the minds of the people of this island. He was their protector, their savior. He had sex with their island, and he was also a nymph, but sometimes an island. And in a lot of ways, it's fitting that Helios was the god of this island because one of the greatest threats to face the island came from another man, one who was often conflated with Helios. I'm talking about Alexander the Great.
What's really a shocker is Alexander the Great appearing in this episode once again because he's connected to almost all of the wonders, except maybe the pyramid.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso. Introducing Virtuo Up, the latest in a long line of innovation from Nespresso. It's innovation you can touch, sense, and taste in every single cup. With a 3-second start, easy open lever, and dedicated brew over ice button, it's even easier to enjoy your coffee your way. Sip for yourself. Shop Virtuo Up exclusively at Nespresso.com.
Picture this, a curve in the road, a change in plans. Well, what do you say? With the all-new Audi Q3, the answer's always yes. Yes to adventure. Yes to escape. Yes to performance. Yes to comfort. Yes to right now. Because saying yes without hesitation, that's real luxury. The all-new Audi Q3, made for the yes life.
This episode is brought to you by Peloton. Welcome to your Peloton Pilates era. Trusted by over 2 million members, experienced instructors with true Pilates expertise, offering classes for every level. Choose from 10 to 45-minute sessions with little to no equipment. Anytime, anywhere. And with the cross-training swivel screen, you can move seamlessly from cardio to mat. Press Pilates. Small moves, big impact. Find out more at onepeloton.com/Pilates.
So now we get to why the Colossus of Rhodes was built. The island of Rhodes was in that covetable position, that strategic area that made it such a hub of the ancient Mediterranean shipping lanes. It was, and it still is, a gateway to Asia, Crete, Africa, and mainland Greece. So it should come as no surprise that throughout its history, it had to face off many invaders. Rhodes, as we mentioned earlier, even became a part of the Delian League at one point. The island was a powerful ally to Greece, and that's why when a certain young Macedonian prince began his world conquest tour, Rhodes was on his list of places to bring under heel. During the 4th century BC, Alexander the Great began his wars of conquest. He lived from 356 to 323 BC, and during his short life, he died at the age of 32, he created a vast empire. There are many excellent books and podcasts that recount the story of Alex the Great, his links to divinity. His mother Olympias claimed he was a son of Zeus. There were a host of reasons she did this, including trying to get her son ahead in the succession and just in general to overshadow her husband Philip. We can't get into all of his life, so here are the highlights.
By the age of 30, Alexander had created one of the biggest empires in the ancient world. His empire stretched from Greece to northwestern India. He was undefeated in battle. He was a bisexual icon with wives and male lovers. He was a student of the famous philosopher Aristotle and a child emperor. I believe he took power at 16. He was as famous as Achilles in the classical world, hailed as a tragic hero taken from this world far too young. I could argue.
I mean, a lot of people would say no, not young enough.
Exactly. In short, Alexander the Great had had it all, right? He was an icon to Julius Caesar, and a statue of Alexander the Great actually changed the course of Julius Caesar's life, but we'll get to that later. There is a very famous and misattributed or misquoted saying that goes like this. Quote, "When Alexander saw the breadth of his dominion, he wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer." This is one of those often quoted sayings that we can't quite attribute. Sometimes this quote is attributed to Milton, who lived in the 1600s AD and mentioned Alexander in his Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained poems. The opposite of this saying appears in Plutarch. It's a saying that Alexander wept because he realized that the world or worlds were so vast that he couldn't conquer them all. It was like futile. And I wanted to include this quote and some context around it because it tells us so much about the legacy of Alexander and what people thought about him. By the time he was 30, Alexander had conquered large swaths of the Mediterranean in Asia, and he found himself in the position now of having to administrate his empire.
It turns out that it's not just about conquering, you also have to rule.
You do. And one of the big things that Alexander did as he conquered places was to found a city, generally one named after himself. There were about 70 of these cities, the most famous of which is Alexandria in Egypt. He also wanted to name cities after his favorite horse and his dog. And, I guess as much as I have some real issues with Alexander, I kind of have to like a guy who wanted to name his city after his beloved animal companions. And I think the other reason I wanted to mention this quote that I didn't write down is, as we're seeing over and over again, these 7 wonders are all about colonization. And Alexander here is a real good example of a colonizer.
Well, that's why they're about colonization, is because Alexander was colonizing and affecting in various ways, maybe creating, maybe leading to be created, having to do with in some way all of these monuments. So, the fact that he was such a colonizer is frequently why they're about colonization, or at least they're tied to him. And that's not always the case. Sometimes the colonization doesn't have to do with him, but frequently it at least tangentially relates to him in some way.
Absolutely. And, I wanted to, again, remind everyone that this is kind of what he's famous for. It's this misattributed quote about him being deeply sad that there aren't more worlds to conquer or there are too many worlds to conquer, right? Either way, it's a strange thing to be sad about.
It's a very 7 wonders quote, yes. So in these 70 cities named after Alexander, many would eventually get a statue of Alexander. This was a tradition. And that will become incredibly important later in this story when we talk about Ghost of the Podcast, who will not stop haunting us, Julius Caesar. But for now, let's pause. So Alexander began his work mapping out the empire he'd created, but he didn't live long enough to see said empire flourish. In fact, he died at 32 without a clear successor. Allegedly, when asked about who he would leave his kingdom to, he replied, "To the strongest." And as you can imagine, that went about as well as you can expect.
Yeah, what followed was something Jenny has been dying to cover for about 6 years now, the War of the Diadochi. This series of wars involved the people fighting to be the successor of Alexander. And it's amongst this chaos that we return to Rhodes and to our statue. And things get a little complicated as Rhodes went back and forth between being part of the Persian Empire, being independent, being allied with the Hellenes. And I don't want to get too deep into this rabbit hole because I think I want to return to Rhodes at some point and talk about the island and its rich history. For now, let's just say that during Alexander the Great's time, the island fell under the rulership of Macedonia and, of course, Alexander.
But after the death of Alexander, Rhodes saw no clear successor to ally with, because it was the War of the Diadochi when all these powerful generals that Alexander said, "Fight over my dead putrid corpse of an empire," and they all did as they were told. So Rhodes decided that in the midst of this war, it was a great time to be independent. And we wanted to include this excellent quote from Bettany Hughes' Seven Wonders of the Ancient World because it really breaks down what was on the line for Rhodes, what their time under Alexander looked like, and why this bid for their own freedom and survival was so crucial and risky. Quote, "When Alexander defeated Persia, the Rhodians would find themselves on the wrong side of history. The island forcibly capitulated to Alexander the Great, surrendering with a delegation of 10 ships at Tyre on the western seaboard of modern-day Lebanon in 332 BC, where Alexander had proved his ruthlessness by crucifying many hundreds of Tyre's inhabitants after a 7-month siege when the island city refused to come over to his camp, a public bolt shot of revenge. Rhodes' future looked set, part of the New World Order as dictated by Alexander the Great's appetite. But then Alexander died. Immediately the Rhodians expelled the Macedonian garrison from their city and set their sights on liberty, self-rule, and self-determination. The islanders capitalized on their not-so-secret weapon, their navy, and their shipyards were patrolled by security to prevent industrial espionage or sabotage. As the seamen garnered an ever-growing reputation for their stylish smash-and-grab tactics, the flyweights of sea contest, so the economic reputation of the island grew. Rhodes became a little like the Switzerland of the Eastern Mediterranean, Rhodian businessmen turning up in all kinds of deals, their assets stored on the island. So, let's break this down. So after the death of Alex the Great, the Rhodians took a huge gamble and threw out Alexander's occupying forces. They decided to take this moment of chaos and infighting amongst Alex's successors to take back their freedom. And they knew how dangerous this could be for them because they had the example of what happened to Tyre when all those people were crucified for resisting Alexander. If this move went wrong, then Rhodes could find themselves in a dire situation. But what if it all went right? If it all went right, then they might find themselves as once again major power players with their own autonomy. The reward was too great.
Yeah, and that is the central struggle of Rhodes, right? If it all goes right, the power they have, the ability they have to sit straddling like these 3 different major places and being the force of trade and everything else. Like, I don't blame them. Like, it's terrifying if it goes wrong, but if it goes right, the wealth, the ability to govern yourself, and also
the chance to straddle the whole Mediterranean.
Like a colossus straddling your harbor, protected by a sun god.
Wow. Everybody gets to see up that skirt.
If you're even wearing a skirt. There are theories that the Colossus wore no skirt and just went dong out, balls to the wall. So anyone who controlled Rhodes at this time would become incredibly rich. Goods would be shipped in and out of the island, as well as things created there especially. And the goods would be coming from places like Cyprus, Alexandria, and Egypt, across Europe, Western Asia, and Africa. And we know this because of amphorae that were made with the symbol of Rhodes on it. As Bettany Hughes says, quote, "Centuries later, the Rhodians would still be described as richer than any other Greek people." So, needless to say, this island was once again very, very covetable to anyone looking to dominate trade in the Mediterranean.
Turns out that the Rhodians would prefer to keep their money for themselves rather than having to hand it over to some overlord.
Shocker, they much preferred to be, as they said, like Switzerland, their own economy, their own place, not beholden to anyone, living their own life and making their own deals. Here's the thing. Rhodes' potential did not escape the notice of Alexander's generals, the men, and there were women, who carved up his empire and controlled various sections of it after his death. They were onto Rhodes. And the two parties we need to focus on for the purpose of this episode were the Ptolemies, Cleo's ancestors, who controlled Egypt and the grain supply across the Mediterranean.
And it would have been Ptolemy the First specifically at this moment.
It was Ptolemy the First, and we're going to talk all about him. And also Jenny's Antigonus, the one-eyed. So Antigonus the one-eye, I just want to keep saying his name just like that. So Antigonus the one-eyed was fighting against Ptolemy the First, amongst others, but mostly Ptolemy at this point. And this was for control of Alexander's empire. He'd had an early victory taking over Cyprus as part of his quest to be the next Alexander the Great. Antigonus was keen on getting Rhodes on his side, and he made some big demands of the wealthy island. In 306 BC, King Antigonus, as he liked to be called, he wanted to be called king, he started making some big moves. And Bettany Hughes tells us, quote, Antigonus simply asked for Rhodian ships made of Syrian timber, wanting to harness Rhodian maritime assets in his scrap of acrid rivalry with Ptolemy I in Egypt. The Rhodians complied, and then they thought again. They did not really want to fight. When Antigonus attacked their merchants traveling the swell-ripped seas between the island and Egypt, they quite justifiably fought back. When Antigonus' son, Demetrius the Besieger, rocked up at their coastline, they agreed to parley. But then Demetrius made impossible demands, ordering the surrender of 100 hostages and access for the Antigonid fleet to occupy Rhodes' double harbor and ports around the island. The Rhodians locked their gates, and a storm was unleashed. The siege of Rhodes was about to begin. And I think it's really important here, one of the things that I didn't include was the Rhodians and Rhodes in general were expert shipbuilders, and they had their own ways of doing things, and it was very coveted. So what he asked them to do, Antigonus, was to make some ships for him in a certain way, and they did, and it did not go down the way they wanted it to.
They made the ships for him, and then what?
It sounds like they made the ships, and then they kind of thought, like, we don't really want to be allied with you, because here's the big thing. Ptolemy is grain daddy of Egypt, right? We don't want to piss him off. We need that grain. And they started to realize that, like, they were still getting attacked and caught in the middle of what was going on, and they were like, we're out now.
So they didn't give him the ships.
A little confusing. I think they did, but maybe not. Antigonus wanted these ships built, and the Rhodanes were like, okay, we'll build them. But what they figured out as this was all going on was this was going to put them not Switzerland anymore. They were going to be in the middle of this fight between Antigonus and Ptolemy I, and they did not really want to be in this fight. So they kind of thought again when we're like, we're not sure we really want to do this. I'm not sure the ships ever changed hands. What happened next was that they're finding themselves in the middle of this fight that they don't want to be in the middle of. And so maybe they supplied some ships, but not all ships. And they found themselves pretty much being in exactly where they didn't want to be. And when Demetrius the Besieger came to parley, he just made excessive demands to really try to like bring them to heel. And that's when the Rhodians were like, fuck this shit. We tried giving you what you wanted. Then you still attacked us and put us in the middle of this fight. We tried parleying with you, but you didn't want to be reasonable. So now we're going to siege.
So that is how the stage was set for this siege. Rhodes trying to be neutral. Demetrius and Antigonus don't want them to be neutral. There's a whole fight. Also, Grain Daddy did not want to cross him. And remember what we mentioned earlier, the last siege that involved Alexander and his generals, the one that had made Rhodes agree to become a part of Alex's empire, was the Siege of Tyre. That siege lasted 7 months and resulted in gruesome deaths, the crucifixions of hundreds of inhabitants. So deciding to go against Antigonus in this fashion was terrifying for the inhabitants of Rhodes. But they didn't have much of a choice, because they're caught in the middle between all these powers.
Again, that's the one thing about their island. Like, all this time, it's really good to be in the middle and to get all this wealth being on the shipping route. But when you have a big war conflict like this, you're in the middle of everything. If you can't remain neutral, you're in trouble.
So, Rhodes did have two advantages here. First, they had a very powerful ally in Grain Daddy Ptolemy I of Egypt. Ptolemy, as we keep insisting, controlled the grain and many resources that went in and out of the ancient Mediterranean, and he was on Rhodes' side. So they weren't actually neutral. They were allied with Ptolemy.
Yeah, I kind of think about it like the way the U.S. was at like the start of World War I or World War II, where they're like, we're going to be neutral at the start of this war, but we're kind of going to sell you discounted weapons. Cool, Britain? And it's like, but are you neutral if you're doing that? Not really, but they're not openly fighting, right? That's the kind of neutrality we're talking about.
So this alliance would prove crucial to the survival of the Rhodians when the siege began. Second, Rhodes was known throughout the ancient Mediterranean as a home for smugglers, pirates, traders up to no good, shady traders, if you will, who would often use the island of Rhodes and its hidden coves, beaches, and jetties to hide their ships, treasure, and other plunder. Julius Caesar himself would be taken captive by pirates when going to Rhodes to study rhetoric. So there were many back channels into and out of the island, which made things handy for helping supply a city looking at a long siege.
Demetrius the Besieger was known for being incredibly good at one thing, Jenny. One main thing. It's in his name.
It's making a mean espresso.
I mean, I'm sure he had other skills, but the one he's famous for is besieging cities and breaking their inhabitants.
I have questions about the breaking their inhabitants. Is that like in a BDSM sense or like literal bone breaking or...
Well, if you look at what happened in Tyre, I mean, there was some literal bone breaking. I think it's probably more mentally in getting the siege to, end.
He gets in your head, and he fucks with your mental health.
You walk into a candlelit room where a girl in a feathered mask greets you. Her identity is one of your city's best-kept secrets. No one is supposed to know a nightbird's true face. And that isn't why you came. You came for this girl's rare and highly illegal form of magic. She's about to gift it to you with a kiss, and you know it will be worth the price. Hi, ancient history fangirl listeners. I'm Kate Armstrong, and you might know me as the host over on The Exploress, a podcast where we time travel through history to find out what life was really like for women of the past. Welcome to the world of Nightbirds, my 1920s tinted fantasy novel, which you can buy now wherever good books are sold. I'm popping in to tell you that its sequel, Firebirds, hit shelves on August 27th. If you like female-focused stories with lots of historical inspiration, glittering settings, and intrigue, I think this one might just be for you. So, be careful who you kiss, and fly carefully.
Chronic migraine is 15 or more headache days a month, each lasting 4 hours or more.
Botox, onabotulinum toxin A, prevents headaches in adults with chronic migraine before they start. It's not for those with 14 or fewer headache days a month. It prevents on average 8 to 9 headache days a month versus 6 to 7 for placebo.
Prescription Botox is injected by your doctor. Effects of Botox may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away, as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness can be signs of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Side effects may include allergic reactions, neck and injection site pain, fatigue, and headache. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Don't receive Botox if there's a skin infection. Tell your doctor your medical history, muscle or nerve conditions, including ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects.
Why wait? Ask your doctor, visit BotoxChronicMigraine.com, or call 1-800-44-BOTOX to learn more.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
So, when he rocked up to Rhodes, he meant business. He showed up with, according to Bettany Hughes, 200 ships, 170 supply ships, and a crack team of pirates.
Arr!
Who were promised plunder and a portion of the wealth of Rhodes City when it fell. Remember, Rhodes is incredibly wealthy.
Fat stacks. These people were rich.
Golden toilets. Gilded nipples on everything.
Nobody said they had good taste, just that they had lots of money.
About 40,000 infantry and cavalry waited outside the range of the Rhodian missiles. Their siege engines were all lined up. This shit was about to go down. To those within the city, both the non-combatants and the 7,000 defenders, the sight of so many hostile ships and soldiers invading their harbor or trying to invade their harbor must have been terrifying. And this is what Bettany Hughes tells us how the Verdians began preparing for their siege. Their preparations would actually turn the tide, and there's some mythology in here that is interesting that we'll talk about later. I wanted to show you this quote so you could see how their strategy worked. Quote, "Accounts of how the Verdians reacted give a brilliant insight into the reality of ancient life. They swiftly made provision for the children of the fallen, expelled foreigners they could not trust to fight, and promised slaves turned soldiers their freedom and enfranchisement. But as the islanders raised their harbor walls, Demetrius's men were also raising 4-story-high floating siege machines, carried on cargo ships and protected by a floating boom to prevent ramming. Cretan archers acted as snipers, while Rhodians tried to protect their moles and walls against firebombs and to harry their attackers with fire ships." Do you want me to tell you what a mole is now?
Yeah, what is a mole?
So a mole is like kind of a breakwater you have in the harbor to like kind of keep the water on one side or the other. It kind of like juts out. This is what I'm going to tell you. This is from our Lord and Savior Wikipedia, but I also looked it up in other places. Quote, "A mole is a massive structure, usually of stone, used as a pier, breakwater, or a causeway separating two bodies of water. A mole may have a wooden structure built on top of it that resembles a wooden pier. The defining feature of a mole, however, is that water cannot freely flow underneath it, unlike a true pier."
Okay, so thank you for answering that, because there's a lot of moles that appear in the description of this siege, so I just did not know what that was. Thank you for describing that for me.
Yeah, and essentially, like, if you can't get all the way in, it's a really important, like, area that you need to hold to begin getting into the city.
Right. So let's get into the actual year-long siege, which lasted from 306 to 305 BC. So a lot of what I'm going to summarize here comes from an excellent article on History Hit by Tristan Hughes called How the Island of Rhodes Overcame a Superpower. Unless we directly quote, the information we're giving you comes from there but has been summarized and paraphrased. So, the first engagement or battle was actually kicked off by the Rhodians, which is not how these things normally go. But the Rhodians figured their best bet of getting the siege over and done with was to attack first and surprise the blockaders. The Rhodians were expert shipbuilders, craftspeople, and many of them had their own pirate streaks. Like, they were frequently running their own pirate side hustles.
And again, that's probably also why potentially Antigonus and other people were annoyed with them. It's like, you want to stay neutral, but you're also attacking our ships at night, you know?
It might be a factor. Who knows?
Might be. I don't have anything directly from the sources, and the story I'm telling you is very pro-Rhodes. It might be very different on the other side, so.
Right. So we were discussing who the Rhodians were, some of them moonlit as pirates and smugglers and general all-around shady people. So they figured it was best to take the battle to their enemy before they could fully block the harbor, because remember, this is an island. They need those harbors. They need access to food and supplies coming in from outside. This is how Tristan Hughes tells us things went down. Quote, "Aiming to surprise the blockaders, 3 Rhodian vessels sailed from the harbor, catching Demetrius's navy off guard and sinking many of his supply ships before returning to Rhodes. Undeterred, Demetrius began preparations to attack the harbor. To batter the Rhodian defenses, he placed 2 large penthouses above 2 strapped-together cargo ships with ballistae and catapults stationed inside the raised platforms. At the same time, Demetrius constructed 2 4-story siege towers, also superbly mounted on cargo ships. He filled many of his smaller ships with specialized Cretan archers and artillery. The Rhodians, in response, placed artillery around the harbor, on their ships, wall, and on the mole that protruded from the harbor."
And with that, the battle lines were drawn. Demetrius had readied himself for his attack on the city. At night, he took a crack team and landed at the farthest end of the mole, quickly captured it and created a beachhead about 500 feet from the city wall. He then stationed 400 men there to defend the newly taken area. The next day, Demetrius brought out the big guns, the amphibious siege engines. Amphibious siege engines, Jenny.
I love it. I'm so excited that you're getting excited about amphibious siege engines.
It's like when I think of an amphibious siege engine, I think of like a frog riding a turtle ready for war. like on land or sea. That's what I think every time when I see amphibious siege engines. Little hat, all ready to go.
I'm picturing like something like a boat that wheels up onto land.
Only if that boat is also a turtle sometimes and a frog with a jaunty helmet. These bad babies did a lot of damage to the defenses of the city of Rhodes and its harbor. Catapults, ballistae, and archer fire, remember all those epic Cretan archers, took place on both sides. But Demetrius called for a retreat, and I'm not quite sure why, presumably because of the casualties on his side. And the Rhodians tried to harry and burn the amphibious siege engines, those poor frogs and turtles, by using fire ships.
I have questions about the fire ships, because we've done the whole episode about Greek fire, and this is clearly not Greek fire we're talking about. So what is a fire ship?
I'm not sure. They didn't exactly tell us. I'm assuming potentially a ship that was on fire that they were just using to ram. Because remember, some of these, like the amphibious siege engines, had like stuff around them to keep them from being rammed. So my guess is when they say fire ships, they literally mean ships on fire to try and burn this thing down.
My other question is, what did these amphibious siege engines look like? Because like I was thinking of like a boat with a tower, and Jen was thinking of a frog on a turtle.
Jen was writing a romantasy. Jenny was actually thinking strategically.
Anyway, I'm looking at this paragraph, and just to remind you what these siege engines look like, Demetrius, our buddy, placed 2 large penthouses above 2 strapped-together cargo ships with ballistae and catapults stationed inside the raised platforms. At the same time, Demetrius constructed 2 4-story siege towers, also superbly mounted on cargo ships. So there are siege towers on top of cargo ships. So there's various like ships filled with artillery archers, and there's 4-story siege towers on top of cargo ships, and there's penthouses on top of 2 strapped-together cargo ships.
And also, there are turtles and frogs with little siege tower backpacks.
Some kind of a tower on a boat.
That can then be wheeled onto land. It can be breached and then brought up, yes. So anyway, the Rhodians tried to harry and attack and burn down these amphibious siege engines using ships that were probably literally on fire. And this was not successful. But potentially that had been Demetrius's plan all along, to get the Rhodians to try to follow his ships and in the process, maybe have them destroy their own fire ships. It's unclear. It's to take away the ability of them to run blockades and that kind of stuff, right? It's really unclear what was going on here. What we do know for sure is that the amphibious siege engines, frogs and turtles with siege backpacks, lived to fight another day. Demetrius followed up this assault with a second assault pretty soon after the first one. And again, the amphibious siege engines took center stage. They were used to batter the defenses of the Rhodians at sea.
And on land, Demetrius had his army use ladders to scale the city walls. Both sides faced very heavy casualties, and eventually it was clear that the Rhodians had won this round. Demetrius withdrew to prepare for his third assault. He was convinced that the city of Rhodes would fall to him. So, for his third appearance, Demetrius took a different tack. He used his lighter ships, manned with archers, to rain down fire on the Rhodian vessels in the harbor and on the seas. He also used the amphibious siege engines in a clever and terrifying way. This is a quote from the History Hit article by Tristan Hughes. Quote, "In the meantime, 3 of his amphibious siege engines bombarded the harbor defenses. The ballistae targeting the wall itself, and the catapults aiming at the defenders on the ramparts. It was a terrifying assault, and soon the Rhodian defenses began to waver. Yet despite heavy arrow fire, Rhodes' sailors managed to extinguish the fires on their ships. Seeing the perilous situation, they proposed a desperate strategy. 3 of their most agile ships were manned with the best Rhodian sailors. They rode through heavy fire right towards Demetrius' siege engines and rammed them. In such a daring, suicidal move, the Rhodian ships managed to destroy 2 of these formidable engines. Soon, the Rhodian ships were surrounded and destroyed, while the 3rd engine escaped. So 1 amphibious siege engine survived, and the other 2 bit it. Yet, in this daring act, Rhodes had saved its harbor from almost certain capture. Demetrius once again was forced to retreat.
And at this point, Demetrius must have felt more like Demetrius the Retreater and less like Demetrius the Besieger. But I digress.
Look, I'm good at one thing.
Now, before either side could plan an attack, Mother Nature stepped in and threw this entire siege into chaos. A huge storm battered the island. Demetrius was unable to launch a new attack, and his holdings on the mole of Rhodes were in jeopardy. The Rhodians, Knowing this was a chance to overwhelm that outpost, launched wave after wave of attacks, harrying the mole long enough for Ptolemy I to sneak into the harbor with about 650 troops and some much-needed reinforcements.
Granddaddy Ptolemy. Where did he come from?
He came from the storm.
Whoa.
Right?
God.
Can you imagine there's this horrible, I guess, hurricane-like storm battering everything. These poor people are like trying to stay alive in these boats being tossed back and forth. And in the midst of this, the Rhodians are overwhelming the mole. They're overwhelming this one place they have on land. And then Granddaddy Ptolemy comes out of nowhere, out of the thunder and lightning in his ships.
Because he knows hunger is a weapon.
And he knows that if his ships can survive this storm, they can change everything right now.
Yeah.
I'm making you like Ptolemy the First.
That's awkward for me.
It's awkward for everyone.
It's awkward for all of us. You know, I like a good problematic daddy with a protective streak who emerges from the storm with snacks. Anyway, so after this assault, Demetrius decided he was no longer fucking around. That's it. I was playing before, but now I'm getting serious.
No more Mr. Nice Siege Daddy.
He planned a land assault on Rhodes. He built an epic siege tower because he didn't have enough of those yet, called a Heliopolis. I feel like just Demetrius the Siege Daddy just builds more and more elaborate machinery.
To siege. That's the thing he loves to do. It's like, I want to siege you up, babe.
Oh yeah, it's his favorite activity.
I want to siege you all night, all day, and for the next 12 months.
That and macrame.
You're telling me you're going to siege daddy me and also make me some throw blankets and things to hold my hanging plants? Yes!
So here's what Tristan Hughes tells us about this wacky assault that's just getting wackier by the minute. Quote, Demetrius the Siege Daddy had learned from his previous mistakes employing siege towers, placing iron plates over the wooden frame to prevent it from catching fire. So large and heavily fortified was this tower that it apparently needed 3,400 men to move it. Was Demetrius the Besieger compensating for something, is the question.
I don't think so. I think he was very, happy with his capabilities, his macrame skills, I think he was like, look, I know how to get in here, but it's going to take a lot of men, it's going to take a lot of wood, and it's going to take some time.
It's going to take some penetration, if you know what I mean.
I mean, I skirted around that, but just get in there.
And I am 100% up to this task. So anyway, it was in this act that Demetrius earned the nickname Poliorcetes, meaning the besieger of cities. So this is when he started to get called Siege Daddy. And while all this is happening, Demetrius had sappers. So a sapper is what, like a tunneler or something?
It's a tunneler who kind of is going down and tunneling into areas to, in later times, it would be set bombs. And this time it'd be tunnel underground to degrade the walls and help make them fall down. I'm not exactly sure what they did.
While all this was happening, Demetrius had sappers, people digging underneath the ground, stationed along Rhodes' walls to try to bring them down. However, the Rhodians were prepared for this. They dug their own tunnels and fought it out with the sappers underground. So they were having hand-to-hand combat in these tunnels. It was wild.
Yeah, I mean, I'm telling you, this siege was next level. Finally, Demetrius broke through the walls of Rhodes, and this is what he found. Again, it's a quote from Tristan Hughes, quote, eventually, with aid from the Heliopolis, manned with numerous ballistae and catapults, and his other artillery, a breach formed in the Rhodian wall, and the Rhodian forces retreated. To Demetrius's dismay, his forces broke through only to see a hastily completed second wall now standing in their way. Demetrius was running out of patience. A daring assault was needed, picking his best men and placing them under the command of his most experienced general, Alcimus. Demetrius ordered a blitzkrieg night assault on the city. Alcimus's force quickly broke through the second wall's defenses, reaching as far as the theater in the city with 1,500 soldiers. There, a vicious fight ensued between the attackers and the Rhodian defenders. Many fell on either side, but eventually the Rhodians, fighting zealously for their homeland, overcame Demetrius's forces. Of the 1,500 men that had reached the theater, all were either captured or killed, including Alcimus himself.
So, Demetrius' land assault had failed. So it's interesting that he gets that nickname from a siege that he didn't win.
I will say this, the account I'm giving you is very pro-Rhodes. I would very much like to revisit this from Demetrius' point of view. We don't really have time for that because this isn't just about that. And the triumph of Rhodes here is super important to the building of the Colossus. But maybe on the Patreon, I could relook at it and have some other thoughts, because some of the stuff that Demetrius is doing here, the siege towers, the amphibious siege engines, like this is all very clever stuff. I think he's getting a little bit painted unfairly because the narrative here is how great the Rhodians are and why they built the Colossus. There is more to the story, but I need to keep this simple because the whole thing can't be about the siege of Rhodes.
It's possible that this account is less factual and more pseudo-historical because it's in service to this Rhodian myth, right?
Yeah, and the sources here are quoting it because the Rhodian myth that we're going to get to and what's going to happen is a very David and Goliath. But like eventually what happens is they call a stalemate and they have to parlay. And it's like, well, if you have a stalemate, then did either side really win? I don't know.
Right, so let's get back to what actually happened next. So Demetrius had tried this elaborate land assault. There were sappers, there was a Heliopolis siege tower. He got a whole new nickname. People started calling him Siege Daddy. And then finally, when he broke through the Rhodian wall, what did he find? Another wall. And then his favorite general broke in and there was a whole theater where they got slaughtered and captured to a man. So anyway, Demetrius the Besieger returned again to trying to besiege the city of pirates and craftspeople. He's like, fine, I'm going to pick up my battered, bruised body and do this again. But his time had run out. See, his dad, Antigonus the One-Eyed, recalled him, forcing Demetrius to make peace with the Rhodians. See, maybe this is the excuse. Like, well, I would continue to beat you guys up, but my dad says I have to go now.
Again, I so want to cover this from the other angle. But yes, potentially that's what happened.
I'm just sensing, like, okay, I guess I'll let you guys live.
Same. And I have definitely written it that way, and that's the tact I'm taking. If you're a very serious military historian, I'm sorry. Don't at me. I'm not going to reply.
Don't cite us in your PhD thesis, please. So anyway, Demetrius's dad was like, Demetrius, it's time to come home now. Dinner's ready. And Demetrius had to make peace with the Rhodians. This meant that an armistice had to be drawn up, essentially keeping Rhodes independent, making them an ally of Antigonus unless Antigonus was at war with Ptolemy. So they were allowed to side with Ptolemy, but if Ptolemy and Antigonus weren't at war, they had to side with Antigonus. It was a treaty that allowed Rhodes to have what they wanted, essentially, independence and the ability to keep good relations with their friend Granddaddy Ptolemy I, who earned the name Ptolemy Soter, or Ptolemy the Savior, as a direct result of appearing out of the wind and the storm with the grain in this siege.
How many times have we called him or seen it written Ptolemy Soter and not known where it came from? It comes from this siege. Ptolemy the Savior.
Ptolemy the Savior shows up with snacks at the critical time. So they got to stay friends with Ptolemy Soter, Granddaddy Ptolemy, and support Antigonus at the same time and not get beat up by him. For a people who prided themselves on their craftsmanship and trade and ability to make a deal, it was a huge win, even if it had to officially be called a stalemate. In the eyes of the Rhodians, after a year-long siege, they had triumphed over Demetrius the Siege Daddy. There was much rejoicing. And now, we finally get to talk about the Colossus.
This episode is brought to you by Palmolive. Family time isn't just the big moments. It's weeknight dinners, sitting around the table, everyone talking all at once. So when the plates are empty and the sink is full, use Palmolive Ultra. Palmolive's most powerful formula removes up to 99.9% of grease, leaving your dishes sparkling clean. And the new convenient pump makes cleaning even easier, so you can spend less time tackling dishes and more time together. Shop now at palmolive.com.
We all have that dream trip we've been wishing we could go on, but too often life, or usually price, gets in the way. That's why Priceline is here to help you turn your dream trip into reality. With up to 60% off hotels and up to 50% off flights, you can book everything you need for your next adventure. Don't just dream about that next trip. Book it with Priceline. Download the Priceline app or visit Priceline.com and book your next trip today.
Go to your happy price, Priceline.
Spring is here, and there's a whole new way to chai at Starbucks that's made perfect for you. Choose your sweetness, dial it up, or keep things light. Add a touch of pistachio, a hint of strawberry, or vanilla, or make it a spring classic with lavender.
Because this season, there's endless ways to chai at Starbucks.
So, the Rhodians were so proud of their defeat of Demetrius the Siege Daddy that they wanted to do something to mark the occasion. And what they chose to do was erect a giant statue of the island's patron god, Helios, to thank Helios for his protection, for not allowing the island and the city to fall to Demetrius the Siege Daddy, and to commemorate the epic Rhodian victory. It was a total flex, and I have to say I'm here for it.
I mean, it is questionable whether this was actually a victory, but they're really selling it to us like it was a victory.
That's so important because there's a lot of mythologizing that goes on about this, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So finally, so many pages into this episode, we're going to tell you about this statue. Let's talk about how the people of Rhodes financed this epic statue. So, as I said, the Colossus was set to be a massive structure. The sources tell us that it stood over 108 feet tall. The cost of building such a marvel would have been enormous. And while Rhodes was wealthy, even it had its limits. So, the story goes that Demetrius's discarded siege engines were melted down and dismantled to be used as part of the Colossus. And that's one story, and that story has a lot of romantic elements to it, right? You know, those horrible engines of war and oppression used by this huge superpower against this tiny island nation were turned into a great work of art honoring the gods. And that tiny island that could, that's the narrative, Jenny, that we all want to get behind, right? That's the myth-making that we love. Like, oh, these horrible engines of war and destruction were actually used for something so good. The other narrative is much less sexy. It claims that the engines were either sold for parts or potentially sold on in the arms trade to the highest bidder, and I would imagine that would potentially be Ptolemy I. But I have seen no direct sources state this.
I think that's pretty incisive, though. I mean, theoretically, yeah. But would they get in trouble with Antigonus and Demetrius if they were selling off their own siege engines to Ptolemy? Probably.
Only if they got caught.
Good point.
Anyway, that theory is less sexy, but I think it's also quite probable.
Construction on the Colossus probably began around 292 BC, and the statue was completed in 280 BC. Sources conflict about a lot of the details that we're about to tell you, so take all of this with a grain of salt. A huge boulder of salt. Chares of Lindos, a student of Lysippos, one of the greatest sculptors of his time, alongside Praxiteles, who famously sculpted Argal Phryne, was the mastermind behind the Colossus. Lysippos was the sculptor trusted to create statues of Alexander, so he was like Alexander's personal sculptor.
He was Alexander's personal sculptor, and he was the guy who trained Chares of Lindos, who is the guy who eventually made the Colossus. Do you see the connection?
Yes. And remember earlier when I mentioned that Alexander the Great and Helios became conflated a lot after his death? There's a reason for this. The guy who trained Chares of Lindos was the guy who sculpted Alexander. See the connection? It's pretty big. It's flashing in neon lights right above your head right now. And if the final Colossus of Rhodes looked a little like that Macedonian prince we're all talking about, well, it's possible that wasn't a mistake. After all, when the siege ended, statues of Alexander and Antigonus, which would have been on the island, weren't destroyed.
Yeah, they would have had them from when Alexander came in, and they chose not to destroy them because they were considered works of art.
There would have been statues of Alexander and Antigonus on the island, and they were not destroyed after this siege. No, they were kept by the city of Rhodes because they were works of art, potentially even made by the great Lysippus himself. And if you just so happen to have a statue of Alexander with that beautiful, youthful face, and you wanted to raise a Colossus to show off your defeat over Alexander's successors, well, let's just say that this was a good way to tell others who wanted to take the island for themselves to fuck right the fuck off.
He was dead, and they were like, no one else is ever going to take over our island again. Look at our fucking statue. See that statue with Alex's face and our sun god? We defeated all the successors. We win, you lose. Look at his dong. It's a thinking man's penis. It's a grower.
Only proportionally. I mean, it's probably like 10 feet tall.
Probably. So, Chares of Lindos, a native of Rhodes, was the head architect, and he built the statue the way a house is built, essentially one layer on top of another. And this is a quote from an article on Ancient Origins about how the statue was built and what we think it might have looked like. Quote, "The base was made of white marble, and the structure was gradually erected as bronze plates were fortified over an iron and stone framework. According to the book of Philo of Byzantium, 15 tons of bronze was used, along with 9 tons of iron, though these numbers seem low to modern architects. Bronze came from another unlikely source. It was decided to fashion the Colossus from the bronze weapons of their defeated invaders, along with a captured giant enemy siege tower, some 9 stories in height, which served as the scaffolding for the project. Again, that's myth-making. When the statue was finally finished, it was dedicated with a poem, preserved in Greek anthologies of poetry, is what is believed to be the genuine dedication for the text of the Colossus, although I have seen this hotly debated. Quote, "To you, O sun, the people of Dorian Rhodes set up this bronze statue reaching Olympus. When they had pacified the waves of war and crowned their city with the spoils taken from the enemy, not only over the seas, but also on land, did they kindle the lovely torch of freedom and independence. For to the descendants of Heracles belongs dominion over seas and land." And I wanted to include this quote and its descriptions of the process of building the statue for a reason. This article preserves that myth of the bronze and iron coming from Demetrius' siege engines. It also gives us this idea that we see in some places that Helios might have actually been holding some kind of torch. Again, we don't know. And also the reality that this description and this narrative are generally what come down to us in history. It's one version, it's not the only one.
So, none of this is really corroborated by any evidence, right? We don't know this is what the statue looked like.
No, we don't know. No one writing at this time wrote down what the statue looked like. So everything about the statue we're getting later on.
And it wasn't on any coins or anything?
Not the statue. The face of Helios is on coins, and we think that that face would have been the face that they used for the statue because they're Rhodian coins. So we think that's what it was, but we don't know.
Gotcha. So, weirdly, our best ancient source on the construction of the Colossus is Pliny the Elder. Pliny actually went to visit the statue during his lifetime. But by the time Pliny visited the statue, it had already fallen into the sea. He was too late. This is what Bettany Hughes tells us about Pliny's first account of seeing the statue. This is from her book, 7 Wonders of the Ancient World. Quote, "He too had visited the gargantuan sculpture guarding the harbor on Rhodes Island, the Colossus of Rhodes, a staggering 108 feet, 70 cubits high, with a skeleton of iron and a skin of bronze. This was a wonder that became legendary within weeks of its completion. Toppled just 60 or so years, 50 by some estimates, our sources conflict on this precise dating, after it had been built, by a massive earthquake that also brought down the city's walls and caused shipyards on the coastline here to subside by 3 feet. This extreme sculpture actually spent more time on the ground than it did erect." Pliny went on to describe how visitors would try to put their arms around the fallen giant's thumbs. Just one of the Colossus's monster digits was bigger than most life-size statues. In Pliny's day, the hollow guts of the sculpture were still visible, including the interior rocks and iron frame, which gave it ballast. But none of this manufactured material was a match for nature's metal, and it was an earthquake that sent the statue, buckling at the knees, crashing down in around 227 BC. These tumbled remains littered the ground until at least the 7th century AD, when the final remnants of the ample Colossus were melted down for scrap metal.
This is the best description we have of the statue, and it's written by Bettany Hughes, who's paraphrasing Pliny. And Pliny was telling us about this statue hundreds of years after it fell into the sea. The skeleton of iron and bronze and rocks was still standing during Pliny's time. But sources debate exactly where this statue stood. They're very clear that it did not stand astride the harbor of Rhodes. That image, which we're all familiar with, was created in the Middle Ages. And that makes me so sad. They think it probably would have stood more like the Statue of Liberty stands today, where it has 2 legs and it's proportionally balanced that way. Archaeologists and historians today think that the Colossus stood high above the city's Acropolis on a hill at the highest point in the city, so that it could be seen from far away and ideally by people out at sea. The statue would have glimmered in bronze and looked exactly like a fiery god towering over the city and the harbor, protecting its people. It would have been a real flex, a real harken back to memory of how powerful Rhodes was.
So when it fell over, it was in the sea, but people could put their arms around the thumbs? Was there part of it was in the sea and part of it wasn't?
So this is where we're getting to, and this is so hotly debated. Some people think it might have stood on a plinth in the harbor, kind of like how the Statue of Liberty stands today. And then when it would have fallen, it would have been in the sea. It's possible that they might have pushed some of the debris into the sea, not knowing what to do with it. I mean, this was an epic earthquake. There could have been a landslide that knocked parts of the Colossus into the sea. We don't know exactly what happened in this earthquake, and it's not documented. We do know that in the harbor, parts of the Colossus were still sticking up. And when people would come into it, they would reach out and touch it, probably, trying to touch it for good luck or to put their arms around it.
So there were parts of it like the hands sticking up out of the water?
Well, it's unclear because, you have to remember, Jenny, it's a harbor, so it's tidal. And it would have changed over time. Like after this giant earthquake, the shipyard, the walls of the city, everything was destroyed. So you have all this rubble that's now fallen into this harbor. The coastline is completely changed and it's tidal. So sometimes if you're with the low tide, you might be able to see more of the Colossus. And if it's a higher tide, you might not be able to. And again, the entire coastline shifts and changes a lot in this area. But because of the tides, if you go anywhere during low tide, I've been many places, particularly in the UK, where the tide goes out and you can see all these wrecked ships and all kinds of things for miles. And then when it comes in, it disappears. So that is possibly what we would be seeing here. I think a thing to remember is the waters in the Mediterranean are very clear. So you might have always been able to see that god on the seabed, even if you couldn't touch him.
Wow. That's just incredible to imagine. So before falling into the sea, the Colossus of Rhodes was theoretically maybe standing on a single plinth with its legs together. Not straddling. There is no straddling happening here.
Still debate about where that plinth was. I mean, most people agree it was probably high above the city. Again, how he got into the sea, I don't know.
We think, based on coins from Rhodes, that the head of the Colossus potentially looked a lot like Alexander the Great. Beardless, handsome, young, with wild, flowing hair, and sometimes, much like Alexander's statues, both masculine and a little femme, or androgynous, I think is the word. This is in contrast to the statue of Fuck Daddy Zeus at Olympia. Fuck Daddy Zeus glowered, had a beard and an aura that was very masculine and made visitors feel as if the statue was alive and judging them from his sweaty perch. Just like a real man.
I mean, just like an archetype of a real man they were trying to project here as their father of gods. That episode was about the colonization of the gods and religion.
It was about, the colonization of a more feminine mode of worship.
Yeah, and a more feminine site.
So it's Bettany Hughes who gives us the most factual descriptions about how the statue might have been built and what methods the ancients might have used to create this massive achievement. In her book, 7 Wonders of the Ancient World, she also mentions that the Rhodians were big fans of granddaddy Ptolemy. I mean, how could that not be? We've discussed this. He was their granddaddy and also their literal ally in defeating Demetrius the Siege Daddy, shows up with snacks at just the right time, striding out of the storm. It's amazing. It's possible that when they were building the Colossus, they had in mind a statue in the scope of some of Egypt's great wonders, like the Colossi of Memnon. The people of Rhodes were such fans of Ptolemy I, with good reason, that they even asked if they could build him a statue and dedicate a state cult to him. I bet he said yes.
It was more about asking their gods if that would be okay or if it would piss off Helios.
Oh, I thought they were asking Ptolemy.
No. So according to Bettany Hughes, this is what the production of the statue might have entailed, and I wanted to include this because it tells us a lot about what modern archaeologists think. Quote, our best estimates are that this statue would have been between 98 and 114 feet tall and must have left some evidence of its manufacture in the island itself. How on earth did the Rhodians complete such a titanic project? Pliny tells us in his Natural History that there were hundreds of bronze workshops in the town close to the Colossus, which continued to produce giant works even after the Colossus had fallen. Ongoing archaeological discoveries brilliantly buttress the historical sources. Rescue digs in Rhodes have come across a number of foundries, some of an industrial scale, from the Hellenistic period. So today, on the hill of Agiostephanos, in cellars that are 2,300 years old, there are giant pits, 11.5 feet wide and 11.5 feet deep, with descending steps. In these dark spaces that taste of time, there is evidence, too, of crucibles and access for giant bellows nozzles. With the runoff channels installed, These discoveries point to the use of the lost wax method, capable of forming complex shapes from molten metal. First, a life-size model with a substructure of wood and clay would have been made and skinned with finely decorated wax. Then, clay molds were produced and heated violently until the wax was eventually melted out and replaced by a bronze shell. Debate rages amongst modern-day sculptors and academics as to exactly how monumental bronze sculptures of the time were produced. Some think they were cast from life. With the Colossus, clearly that was not an option.
And believe it or not, that's all we really know about the statue. It was huge, almost as tall as the modern Statue of Liberty. It did not reside on a plinth at sea level, or maybe it did. And sadly, it did not straddle the harbor. That is the one thing we're sure about. And it did not, even one time, give everyone who sailed into Rhodes the unfortunate or perhaps fortunate moment of upskirting a probably naked, very muscular, well-hung god, shall we say. It took about 12 years to build the Colossus of Rhodes, and the statue stood watching over the harbor and island for 54 or 56 years, watching everyone masturbate, like a Helios would. The statue was raised as a marvel and thing of hope and wonder and beauty, a thank you to the deity who protected their island and to the friendships that had seen Rhodes through a bitter siege. But the statue was felled by the very earth itself when a huge earthquake rocked the island in 226 BC, leaving the skeleton of the statue standing, but most of the beautiful bronze ornamentation and design lying in ruins along the seabed. At least that's one theory of how things collapsed.
Well, we know it collapsed because of the earthquake.
Well, we know it collapsed, just like how it collapsed and where everything fell. It's like theoretical.
Yeah. Much like the island of Rhodes, which, as you all recall, was gifted to the god Helios, the statue returned to the sea. It's said that Ptolemy III offered to pay for the reconstruction of the statue, but the island of Rhodes declined, fearing, based on a prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi, that building another statue might anger the gods. The ruins of the statue must have been awful to walk past or sail past. A statue that had been raised out of triumph and hope now lay smashed and destroyed on the ground and in the sea, a reminder that the gods could give and take away just as quickly. And the statue stayed there for about 900 years, a constant reminder of that time Helios stood guard over Rhodes. The statue spent more time on the seafloor than it did as a standing wonder.
But our story isn't quite over yet. Remember when we mentioned that there was more than one Colossus? Well, there was. Not to the scope or scale of the Colossus, but Pliny the Elder tells us there were about 3,000 bronze statues on Rhodes that he saw during his visit and about 100 colossi. What were these statues? Were they lost works of gods? Of Alexander or Heracles or Helios? Who were these mysterious other colossi? And what made up this crop of giant statues? Was there like a forest of colossi? How tall does a statue have to be considered a colossus? Were they all replicas of the original colossus, or were they older than that original colossus, and was that colossus just built on a tradition of other colossi that were not quite as big? Questions. Were there any as tall as the big legendary one? Were there some that were taller? How tall did they grow when they were just allowed to grow unimpeded? We do not know.
In their garden. Of Babylon.
Right, it's like the Hanging Garden of Colossi. We've combined two wonders.
Both of which we know very little about.
I mean, look, why not, right?
We literally made huge episodes out of things we know so little about.
I know. It's because we have wild imaginations, Jen, and so did a lot of other people.
Listen, if we've got any artists out there and they want to draw me some amphibious frogs and turtles with siege engine backpacks, I would love you. Thank you.
There's a lot we don't know, as we've discussed. But there are a few things we do know, and one of them is that Julius Caesar...
He said that he really wanted to appear in this episode for you because he misses talking to his fiancée, and I'm not saying any more.
I would, invite him on, but I'm tired, and I'll call him later when I've had a nap. Anyway, and one of them...
I bet you'll see him in your dreams.
Right, that's what that means. So, we do know a few things, and one of them is that Julius Caesar, ghost that haunts this podcast, spent a part of his youth in Rhodes. He would have seen the ruins of the Colossus, maybe gazed upon that handsome, sexy Alexander-like face that stared up at him from the seabed. He would have been surrounded by the history of an underdog island that stood up to a superpower and won and could not stop bragging about it. A story that was spun in the ancient world as a victory for the little guy, a victory of diplomacy, a victory that involved Rhodes doing the unexpected time and time again to keep Demetrius the siege daddy on the ropes. Sound familiar? It was while traveling to Rhodes that Julius Caesar was kidnapped by pirates, and it was later in his life, around 68 BC, after the death of his beloved wife Cornelia, that Julius Caesar would be sent to Spain. And it was in Spain, while serving as quaestor, that Julius Caesar would again come across a statue that would change his life, and this one was of Alexander the Great, possibly sculpted by Lysippus himself. And when Julius Caesar looked at this statue, one that might have even borne some resemblance to the fallen Colossus of Rhodes under the sea, that Julius Caesar wept. He had a quarter-life crisis, because at this point he was still only about 30 or something. Alexander had conquered half the world by that age. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome, he returned a changed man, a man who had his own plan to build an empire. And that, my friends, is when Julius Caesar got together with Pompey and Crassus to form the first triumvirate. Look it up.
The Siege of Rhodes and the Treaty of Rhodes became touchstones to the Romans. They used the example of this siege and treaty as kind of a best practice for how to enact diplomacy over might. And that myth would repeat on and on throughout history.
They did get super lucky that Antigonus was like, all right, Demetrius, it's time to quit playing with your friends and come inside.
And they got super lucky that there was a storm and that Ptolemy was able to bring them reinforcements when he could. And there's just a lot of luck a lot of times, whether you win or lose at things. You can be the most powerful and still have bad luck.
And the Rhodians would say, no, that was the favor of the god, which is why we had to build a whole statue.
And then it fell into the sea. Anyway, and then the sea claimed him.
Like it claimed Helios after he had sex with their island. Anyhow.
Maybe the island was like, I would like the statue down here where I can enjoy it. Anyway.
Yeah.
So the ruins of the broken god remained on the seabed of Rhodes' harbor for 900 years or so, until the Arab invasion of Rhodes in 654 AD. During this invasion, the bronze was collected for scrap metal, and it took over 1,000 camels to cart the remains of the fallen god off to be recycled into something new, something else. And we see remnants of the Colossus of Rhodes all the time. Helios is present in the Statue of Liberty. Her name is actually the new Colossus. She stood a lot longer than her predecessor by hundreds of years. She holds aloft a torch, a light to guide people to a new island, a new home, and maybe a new kind of freedom, although that's debatable. She holds aloft a torch, which may or may not be based on Helios holding a torch. There are some illustrations, particularly the one from medieval times, that show him holding a torch. We don't know. I'm glad the Statue of Liberty isn't straddling anything. Now that I say it.
Straddling the Hudson.
Straddle that Hudson.
I don't know that would be sanitary. So this torch is a nod to Helios and the life-giving light of the sun. You can see the Colossus of Rhodes in political cartoons and satire, asking about the hubris of men and their desire to straddle the realms of nature or the gods. Generally, these cartoons erroneously reference the image of the Colossus from the medieval ages, which is all about that straddling.
And this is where I'm just going to stop for a moment. We're almost done, I promise, to talk about the whole colonization of this series. Because is there any other ancient wonder in this series that wasn't about the colonization of a people or a place or worship, of colonizing nature or the gods or the wild?
Well, the pyramids.
Yeah, the pyramids. I have one more episode left to write this season, one on the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. And I hope that I find some other message other than that colonialism made humans build huge towering edifices to themselves. But at this point, Jenny, I'm not so sure. So that is all we really know for sure about this lost statue. It would have glimmered on the horizon, visible to anyone at sea, letting them know that they were headed towards Rhodes, the island protected by Helios, unconquered by Antigonus the One-Eyed and siege daddy Demetrius. But the actual description of the statue, the scope and size of it, are only known by what was left behind, in clues like coins and the descriptions of travelers steering their boats around the ruins of a shattered god.
So that's it for this week.
That's it for this week. Thank you all so much for listening. If you want to find us, we are on all the socials, Threads, Instagram, Facebook. We still keep updates only on Twitter because it's kind of turned into a hellscape.
All of those platforms, Ancient History Fangirl, except for the one on X/Twitter, which is Ancient His Fan, but we really only update there.
And if you want to help us keep doing the work that we're doing, we have a Patreon. That is how we're able to keep the podcast running. Our Patreon is patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. For the low, low price of $3 a month, you get bonus episodes, early ad-free episodes, and to know that you're doing good in the world by supporting our podcast.
Yeah, so thank you so much for listening, and we will see you whenever we see you next.
Grown-ups, if there's a child in your life who is interested in, curious about, or fascinated by people and places from history, then my podcast, The Past and the Curious, might just be a hit in your home. From the invention of microscopes to world-traveling dogs to fashions of the 1890s, gold rush ghost towns, and audiences going wild for walking competitions, we've got a little bit of it all. Hosted by children's author and museum educator Mick Sullivan, that's me. The show is fun, funny, engaging, honest, and beloved by kids and parents alike. Find The Past and the Curious at all the usual podcast places.